please welcome our chapter, JBS chapter leader, Trinity Baptist Church, Pastor Dan Fisher.
Thank you, Clark, for that warm welcome, and I want to say what an honor it is to be here today, to be a part of this event, and to serve alongside all of you. As Clark said, I am the pastor of Trinity Baptist Church in Yukon, Oklahoma. I've been there now almost 19 years. I am also one of the leaders of the Oklahoma City Tea Party, and I have the distinct honor of serving alongside my good friend Paul Blair on the board of Reclaiming Oklahoma for Christ and Reclaiming America for Christ, where we are aggressively engaged in an attempt to awaken the sleeping giant in America, the church. We believe if we could ever get pastors engaged in this culture war that we're fighting, we could indeed turn the tide. I also am married to the former Pam Lofton from Van Buren. Pam and I have been married now almost 30 years. We have two children, Jacob, who is finishing his pre-med courses in college. He's a senior in college. And then my daughter, Rebecca, who is a freshman in college, who is also beginning to pursue a career in medicine. Well, my task today is to talk about the silencing of Christianity in America. As most of you know, there are forces today that are intent upon silencing the voice of the church. I find it amazing that it's acceptable in America to be anything but a Christian. You can't speak out against any other religion, specifically religions like Islam. We bend over backwards to try to accommodate the Muslim faith in America. But when it comes to Christianity, it seems like there are no rules, and anything you want to say is fine. And there are great attempts being made to censor the Christian voice in America. So I want to take these next few moments and talk about some of the ways in which those who hate the church and who hate what the church stands for are trying to silence our voice. Ann Coulter, who many of you are familiar with, wrote a book not long ago entitled Godless. And in that book, she said this: if a Martian landed in America and set out to determine the nation's official state religion, he would have to conclude it is liberalism, while Christianity and Judaism are prohibited by law. Well, unfortunately, I think she's right. In an ever-increasing hostile world, we believers are finding ourselves pushed back into a corner. Now, this shouldn't surprise us. In fact, in John chapter 15, verse 18 through 20, Jesus said this: if the world hates you, you know that it hated me before it hated you. If you were of the world would love its own. Yet because you are not of the world, but I chose you out of the world, therefore the world hates you. If they persecuted me, they will also persecute you. And then later on in John 16, verse 33, Jesus said, these things I have spoken to you, that in me you may have peace. In the world you will have tribulation, but be of good cheer, I have overcome the world. And then Paul said in 2 Timothy chapter 3, writing to a young preacher by that name, Timothy, he said, and all who desire to live godly in Christ Jesus will suffer persecution. So it shouldn't surprise us that in our world today, there are those who are very hostile to Christianity. It was that way at the beginning. And they are doing everything that they can do to silence us. Now, we live in a nation that is built upon certain basic principles, the principles of life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness or property. And in this nation, now for well over 2 centuries, we have had the freedom to express our religious beliefs, the freedom to practice those beliefs in whatever way that we felt was pleasing to God. In fact, that was the very basis of the foundation of our nation. In fact, John Quincy Adams, the 6th President of the United States, said this. He said, "The greatest glory of the American Revolution was that it bound together in one indissoluble bond the principles of Christianity and civil government." So we live in a nation where historically we have had the freedom to practice our religious beliefs freely without any concern for government intrusion. But that has been slowly changing over the past 75 to 100 years. In fact, we live in a nation today where people don't really understand the history of our founding. They don't really even understand the Constitution. Many have not even read it, so they don't even understand the principles that undergird our nation. Folks today in our culture are sometimes shocked when some of us say that we're a Christian nation. But the fact is, America was founded as a Christian nation. It's only been in the last few decades, as I said, that people have started to rewrite our history and certainly believe what has been rewritten about our history. Let me give you an example. In the mid-1800s, our country, our government was being sued because these folks believed that America was not a Christian nation. It was never formed as a Christian nation. And so the House of Representatives and the Senate both assigned to their judiciary committees the job of researching and determining whether or not America was founded as a Christian nation. Now I'm going to show you an excerpt from the House Judiciary Report, but the report in the Senate was very similar. In 1854, the House Judiciary Committee came back with a report, and I want to read to you just a portion. They said, and I quote, "Had the Founding Fathers during the Revolution a suspicion of any attempt to war against Christianity, that revolution would have been strangled in its cradle. At the time of the adoption of the Constitution and its amendments, the universal sentiment was that Christianity should be encouraged. In this age, there is no substitute for Christianity. That was the religion of the founders of the Republic, and they expected it to remain the religion of their descendants." So when you do much study about the history of our country, it's undeniable that America was originally founded as a Christian nation. It was based upon biblical principle. In fact, the document most quoted by the founders was the Bible. So what are some of the ways that our government and our culture are trying to silence Christianity in America? Well, one of the ways is through the different departments and offices and administrations of our government, which actually form a shadow government in America. For instance, let's consider the Department of Homeland Defense. On April the 7th, 2009, many of you may be aware of the report that they released. Janet Napolitano released this report that was designed to outline the greatest threats to America. Now, when you read through this report, it's amazing that one of the greatest threats, radical Islam and Muslim jihadists, are not even mentioned. And many of us were surprised to find that the number one threat in America would be conservatives. And so our Homeland Defense Department considers many of us in this room as the greatest threat. Now let me show you some of the parts of this report. On page 2, we find this. Right-wing extremism in the United States can be broadly divided into those groups that are mainly anti-government, rejecting federal authority in favor of state or local authority. Well, let me first say that none of us in this room are anti-government, but we are anti-government that is unconstitutional. And yes, we do favor, as our founders did, state and local government over federal government. In fact, our nation was formed and our Constitution was written creating strong state and local governments and a weaker federal government, because our founders were smart enough to know that you can get your hands on local government, but it's very difficult to reach out and touch federal government all the way over in Washington, D.C. Now, page 2 goes on to say, it may include groups and individuals that are dedicated to a single issue, such as opposition to abortion or immigration. So notice then, if you are pro-life, anti-abortion, then they consider you a tremendous threat. On page 3, it says, many right-wing extremists are antagonistic toward the new presidential administration and its perceived, notice that word perceived, stance on a range of issues. And of course what they're implying there is we're not really smart enough to know what they really are trying to do, so we misinterpret. They go on to say these perceived stances on a range of issues, including immigration. So there's a second time that they've mentioned immigration and citizenship. Well, let me say that none of us are against legal immigration. Now, we might feel like we need to limit immigration from time to time, but it's not legal immigration that we're upset about. It's illegal immigration. We're against illegal immigration. They go on to say the expansion of social programs to minorities and restrictions on firearms ownership and use. Well, yes, we are upset about intrusions into our Second Amendment rights. So, yes, if the federal government is placing restrictions on one of our inalienable rights given to us by God, not government, and then enumerated in our Bill of Rights, then yes, we're upset when they try to restrict our right to keep and bear arms. Goes on to say, right-wing extremists are increasingly galvanized by these concerns and leverage them as drivers for recruitment. Well, yes, I am trying to recruit those who agree with me, who will stand up against an overreaching, out-of-control government, and we're trying to bring back constitutional government. Do you agree? On page 5, the report goes on to say, debates over appropriate immigration levels and enforcement policy generally fall within the realm of protected political speech under the First Amendment, but in some cases. So in other words, even though, according to the Constitution, we have the right to speak out, in some cases, they say, anti-immigration or strident pro-enforcement fervor has been directed against specific groups and has the potential to turn violent. So, in other words, if you speak out for constitutional principles and you speak your mind, the Department of Homeland Defense sees you as a major threat. And then one more page, let's look at page 7. It says, right-wing extremists will attempt to recruit and radicalize returning veterans. So here now they're saying another great threat, other than constitutionalists, would be those who have served our country, have gone to some other country and have fought and risked their lives, or they've served here domestically, they're veterans, and they're a real threat. So you can see that the Homeland Defense Department believes that if you are, pro-life, if you are in favor of strong state and local government, if you are against runaway immigration and certainly illegal immigration, if you're against the expansion of social programs that becomes lopsided in our government, if you're upset when the Second Amendment is attacked, if you are one who speaks out on First Amendment issues, or if you're a returning veteran, you're the one who's the big threat to our country. So through the departments in our government, they are seeking to silence Christianity. Now, another way in which our government is trying to silence the church today is through hate crime legislation. And in particular, the hate crimes law that was just passed and signed into law in October of 2009. Many of us remember the terrible murder of a young man named Matthew Shepard in 1998. It was a terrible thing, and we're always against any type of crime, and certainly murder in any shape, form, or fashion. It doesn't matter the sexual orientation. Murder has always been and still is against the law. The problem is they used Matthew Shepard as the poster child in order to shove down our throats hate crimes legislation, which in fact goes well beyond what we've always considered the law. In fact, this measure expands the 1969 United States federal hate crime law to include crimes motivated by a victim's actual or perceived gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, or disability. This act is the first federal law to extend legal protections to transgender persons. Now understand what they're saying here. They are going to police perceptions, what you were thinking, not what you did. Now we all know that our laws are written to deal with actions, but this law is written intending to deal with thoughts, with intentions, with perceptions. Now the bill provides $5 million per year in funding for fiscal years 2010 through 2012 to help state and local agencies pay for investigating and prosecuting hate crimes. In other words, they're going to give states money to dig up, to look for hate crimes. Now what's kind of amazing about this is that if hate crimes are so rampant, you shouldn't have to try to find them. They ought to be everywhere. And it's also amazing to me that they're using the Matthew Shepard case and having to reach back into the late 90s. If hate crimes are such a problem, you should be able to use one of the crimes that was committed just last week. Again, evidence that hate crimes are not the runaway problem in America that our government wants us to believe that they are. Well, then why hate crime legislation? Because they want to become the thought police. They don't want to just enforce the laws on the books. They want to enforce laws that they want to put into action that would literally silence or squelch thinking. You see, what they're trying to do is limit our freedom of expression. In fact, this Matthew Shepard Act, this hate crimes legislation, requires the FBI to track statistics on hate crimes against transgender people. And this is the first time, folks, that this has happened in our country. Now, when this law was passed by Congress and then 6 days, I believe, later signed by the President, many spoke out against it. For instance, Pat Toomey had this to say. He said, "I think it's a bad idea for government to legislate on the basis of what they think people are thinking. What's in a person's mind or heart when they create a crime, crime should be prosecuted for what's actually done." And then Michelle Bachmann, representative from Minnesota, said this, quote, "I feel that this hate crime legislation could be considered the very definition of tyranny." And that's exactly what I believe it is. Now they're trying to control not only what we say and do, but what we think. Now there's another way that our government is trying to silence Christianity in America, and that's through judicial tyranny. In numerous countries where hate crimes legislation has been passed, it goes well beyond what we would consider hate crimes. Of course, we all consider all crimes to be hateful. But we have found that in these nations where countries have passed hate crimes legislation, pastors have either been persecuted or prosecuted for speaking out. Now here's a pastor, for example, Ake Green. He's a pastor in Sweden. He was sentenced to 1 month in jail for showing disrespect against homosexuals in the sermon he delivered from his pulpit in the small town of Borgholm, Sweden on July the 20th, 2003. And even though later on his case was thrown out of court, he was going to spend time in jail for preaching from the Bible about what God says about the sin of homosexuality. One of the leaders in Sweden, in fact his name is Lars Ohly, he is a leader of the Swedish Left Party, is working to force pastors in Sweden to perform homosexual weddings or face state punishment. He said, and I quote, "In the long run, it's inappropriate to allow discrimination like this." Now what he means is pastors that refuse to do homosexual weddings because of their belief in Scripture. "We don't think that someone should be allowed to refuse to wed same-sex couples. We have a proposal which we don't plan on walking away from." So you can see that these forces are galvanized and they're going to keep up the fight. They're not going to stop, so therefore we cannot stop. Now some of you are saying, well, that's in other countries. That's not here in America. That would never happen in America. No. Well, notice this. In August of 2008, California doctors were forced to artificially inseminate a lesbian. California's highest court decided that Christian doctors may not refuse to perform artificial insemination for homosexual patients. So it's already coming to America. In fact, attorney Brad Dacus of the Pacific Justice Institute said, "This is not about denying people services. This is instead about the thought police attempting to censor Christian beliefs and Christian perspectives that don't agree with homosexuality." We're talking about individuals being able to force doctors or other professionals to violate their faith in order to keep their job. Already, American citizens are being persecuted with this type of legislation and ideology. For instance, notice on this slide, here's a New Mexico couple that run their own photography agency, and they were fined by the state of New Mexico $6,000 for declining to photograph a commitment ceremony between two lesbians. Here, a California student was punished for his religious speech. In November of 2008, Ryan Dozier, a student at Yuba Community College in Yuba, California, was cited by a campus police officer for sharing his faith and handing out tracts on campus. The officer told him that if he continued to do so without a permit, he would possibly be expelled or arrested. 3 weeks later, he received a certified letter from the president of the college stating that his actions were the subject of a campus crime report. The letter informed him he could face expulsion if he shared his faith on campus again. And over and over and over, you see these types of overreaching of our law enforcement agencies and of laws that are being written. Judicial tyranny is one of the ways in which the church is being silenced. But there's also another way that Christianity is being silenced in America, and that is through workplace censorship. Here's an example. This is John Cash, a meteorologist of the TV station WAVY-TV in Virginia Beach. He was a weatherman, and he was fired for his after-hours Christian ministry. He had worked for WAVY for 21 years, but he also traveled around in his off time as a Christian evangelist preaching at area churches, large and small, and he was fired because they believed that that was a bad influence in his work there at the television station. In fact, the general manager of the station, Doug Davis, said that going into full-time ministry was bad for their business. Here's another example of workplace censorship. This is John Freshwater. He is a school teacher in Ohio. In fact, he's been teaching for 20 years and last year was named Teacher of the Year. Now, he was ordered by the school administration to remove his Bible from his desk, citing a violation of separation of church and state. Right now, there is a woman in my church who is fighting with the school in Oklahoma City for the very same reason. Here's Dr. Michael Campion. Campion previously was a professor at the University of Illinois College of Medicine, and he had done that for 18 years. He conducted employment testing for the city of Minneapolis. This included screening police officers and firefighters. He was terminated in 2007 after it was learned he had a connection with the Illinois Family Institute. Now, that is a Christian pro-family group. And so he lost his job for being involved in a pro-family, pro-life Christian group. So, workplace censorship is a way in which Christianity is being silenced in America. Another way in which Christians are being silenced in America is through sustainable development, rezoning, what is often called Agenda 21. All over the world, groups and countries are meeting together trying to figure out how they can save planet Earth. In fact, they're convinced that humans are a parasite on the planet, and if they don't do something, we're going to destroy the world on which we live. Now, I've read the last chapter of the book of the Bible, and I want you to know right now that the earth is going to survive, and it's going to last all the way through until God is finished. Now, certainly the Bible teaches that we ought to be good stewards of the planet, and we should take care of it. But these green people, of course, have gone overboard, but it's more than just their love for the planet. These people have a political agenda. They are all about silencing those that they don't agree with, and they are all about raising themselves to positions of greater power. And so the green movement, in fact, I'm convinced there's nothing green about it at all. It's a red movement, red as in communism. So throughout the world, you have these gatherings where these countries are trying to pass international laws to limit liberties and freedoms, especially liberties and freedoms in America that are guaranteed by our Constitution. Now, let me give you some examples of what's going on right here in America. In Gilbert, Arizona, the Oasis of Truth, it's a church, was told by a zoning administrator that Bible studies, church leadership meetings, and fellowship activities are not permitted in private homes and was given a violation notice. Avondale Estates in Georgia, the Christ Liberty Family Center was shut down and issued a code violation because city officials said it doesn't have enough room for parking. The church didn't meet local zoning rules that require houses of worship to have 3 acres of land and 100 feet of frontage for parking. Here's another example. Evanston, Illinois. For 6 years, the Vineyard Church in a suburb north of Chicago has been free to meet, sing, and pray in the building they own, just not on Sunday mornings, and they couldn't call their meetings church. Now imagine that. You can meet, you just can't call it church. The building is in an office zone where membership association and cultural institutions like theaters and concert halls are allowed, but worship services are not. So in other words, you can have a concert, you can show a movie to a large crowd, you just can't have church. Under the zoning law, Vineyard could legally stage a production of Fiddler on the Roof, which includes a traditional Jewish wedding, but could not host an actual religious wedding. So this is an example of how these green groups and these anti-Christian groups are using zoning laws to literally silence churches and their communities. Now here's an example that just simply blew me away. What you're looking at, of course, is a picture of a barn. This is a barn that is located in Bedford County, Virginia. A cowboy church has been meeting in Garland Simon's barn. They were recently told by the county that Simon's barn cannot be used for religious services because the 900-acre piece of property isn't zoned for such meetings. Ironically, the barn, they said, could be used for barn dances, but not for religious services. Now see, this kind of idiocy is going on all over our country. Here's an example in Denver, Colorado. Diane Riders received a cease and desist order from the city of Denver for violating zoning codes. The notice stated that the Riders were guilty of excessive prayer meetings. What in the world is an excessive prayer meeting? In their home, and were in violation of a Denver statute which the city interpreted to mean that prayer meetings were allowed only once a month. Imagine that. In Arapahoe County, Colorado, zoning officials imposed limits on the size of congregations that were permitted to operate in various churches. The list just goes on and on. Here's St. Petersburg, Florida. City officials tried to shut down a church because of its many outreach activities to the community by redefining the church as a social service agency. Of course, this type of establishment, then, they said, was not permitted in the zoning district where the church was located. Here's another example. In Orlando, Florida, the city informed a resident that the fellowship, prayer, and Bible studies held in his home amounted to the illegal operation of a home business. So here's a person in Orlando, Florida, who's having prayer meetings and Bible studies in their home, and they've zoned that as a home business rather than a church. Richmond, Virginia. An ordinance requires places of worship wishing to feed more than 30 hungry and homeless people to apply for a conditional use permit at a cost of $1,000 plus $100 per acre of affected property. The ordinance also only allows, now listen to this, only allows 7 days between October the 1st and April the 1st as the times when places of worship may feed the hungry and homeless. Now, you understood that? correctly. Let me say it once more. Their laws, their zoning laws, will only allow churches that wish to feed the hungry and to help the homeless to do so from October the 1st until April the 1st. So, our government is using its own agencies to silence the church. But not only are the agencies like Homeland Defense being used, but we're also using the hate crime legislation to silence Christianity. Also, judicial tyranny is being used to silence Christianity in America. Workplace censorship, where Americans are not even allowed to express their own views in the workplace. In addition to that, zoning laws are being used to silence Christians in America. But let me close with the place where I believe Christianity is being silenced the most in America. And it's a place you would least suspect: the church. It is in the church, I believe, where the greatest silencing of Christianity is going on. Now, obviously not in the churches that are evangelical and serious about the biblical mandate to teach God's Word and do God's work, but there are pastors all over this country who refuse to address the very issues that are silencing our religious freedom. These pastors piously claim, well, we're just about the gospel, and that's true. We are to be about the gospel. But we're also to preach the whole counsel of God and not just cherry pick certain parts that we like or parts that won't get us into trouble. I submit to you that by pastors' silence about all these issues, it could be that the place where Christianity is being silenced the most in America is in the church. Now, for decades, pastors spoke out about these things. Pastors believed that they were supposed to preach to their people about how they ought to vote in elections. In fact, years ago, pastors annually and routinely preached election sermons, but not today. Now, what changed all of that? Well, there are many things, and I believe the compromising of the American pulpit and just compromising our own lives was a big reason. But many of you are aware that in 1954, Lyndon B. Johnson, through the Johnson Amendment, was able to place a restriction in the tax code that does not allow churches, nonprofit organizations to participate in or speak out against political candidates. In fact, let me read the Johnson Amendment to you. It says, nonprofit entities, including churches, cannot participate in or intervene in, including the publishing or the distributing of statements, any political campaign on behalf of or in opposition to, which that phrase was added in 1984, any candidate for public office. So Johnson was able to slip into our tax law restrictions on pastors and churches. Now, the reason he did this is he was running for his second term as senator, and some conservative groups were really giving him some trouble. It looks like they were going to get him beat, and so he was able to, by stealth, slip this into the tax code. And in '54, for the first time in America, pastors were told what they could and could not preach. And over the decades since, this has been used by the IRS to intimidate churches and to intimidate pastors until now. Pastors refuse to speak out on these issues and claim that because of separation of church and state, they're not supposed to. Well, it wasn't until the last 50 years that preachers believed that. All before that, pastors preached out on these subjects. Now, why have they changed? Well, I believe primarily it's because of the fear of losing their following, those who don't want controversy in the church, and these preachers are afraid they're going to lose their non-profit status. This is why people like Paul and I, who were honored to be a part of the original Pulpit Initiative, the Pulpit Freedom Sunday that the Alliance Defense Fund organized, we were part of the original 33 that participated in 2008, have been speaking out against this IRS rule because we believe it's unconstitutional. The First Amendment guarantees the right of Americans to express themselves religiously, and we do not believe that the IRS has the power to restrict religious speech. So, church congregations, especially the leadership, I believe, are silencing their pastors by an incorrect understanding of the entire phrase separation of church and state, which we all believe is not even in the Constitution. So unfortunately, the place where Christianity is being silenced the most is in the church. In Germany, in the days of Hitler, World War II, one of the Lutheran pastors was willing to stand up. Most of the pastors remained silent. But Dietrich Bonhoeffer stood up in the face of what was almost certain persecution and death, and he said this. He said, "Silence in the face of evil is itself evil. God will not hold us guiltless. Not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act." Dietrich Bonhoeffer stood up against the evil of Hitler. In fact, he was even one of the participants in one of the failed assassination attempts. And 4 days before the fall of Berlin, the Nazis executed Dietrich Bonhoeffer. But he went down swinging for what was right. And so you and I, as Christians in America, as freedom-loving Americans, need to speak out. Christianity is being silenced in America, and we must speak out. And the place where we need to speak out the most, unfortunately, is in the church, because it's there that our religious freedoms, I believe, are being most restricted. So, ladies and gentlemen, we have a battle in front of us. I encourage you to stand with us, and if we will stand together, then we can turn this fight around. But we must stand together. Benjamin Franklin was correct. If we do not hang together, we will most assuredly hang separately. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, for your time. God bless you.